There's two ways of thinking about people in organizations. The first way is to think about people as sort of instrumental means to an end, that they are working in service to the organization, and they're sort of, even the term human resources, which is a class that I teach, is this notion that people are resources of the organization. And so they're being used in the service of the organization. And using that instrumental approach, you can still come to the conclusion that you should treat people respectfully and carefully and so on, because you don't want to use up that resource any more than you want to cut all the trees down if you're, making paper or something like that. You need to be stewarding that resource. You need to be caring for it to make sure that it lasts and to make sure that it actually can provide productivity and efficiency for you. So you can make a very practical case for treating people well with this very instrumental kind of reasoning. That instrumental approach is not the approach that I typically take. The approach that I typically take is thinking of people as ends in and of themselves. And that really is driven by my own theological understanding of people being made in God's image. C.S. Lewis says you never meet a mere mortal. Every person that you interact with is this person that is created in God's image that really has eternity in front of them. And when you start to think about that, it really does change the equation in terms of, wow, this is a person in God's image. This is a person that is going to be living beyond this life here on the earth. And so what does that mean as far as my interactions with them? So when you think of people as not means to an end, but as an end in and of themselves, then how you treat them becomes a question in its own right. It's not because then they're going to be more productive, although they may be, but it's because it's the right thing to do. You treat people in certain ways because they are reflecting the image and the glory of God in some sense that we may not fully understand. And so trying to understand every person and their gifts and their talents and their interests and their passions and trying to lead in that light really does change the equation, and it really does change, I think, how we approach managing people in an organizational context. I would say meaningful work is a component of engaging work. So one of the things that makes work engaging is to have it be meaningful. But you and I both know that we can be really engaged with things that aren't meaningful. I mean, I can spend a lot of time on Candy Crush, and it's not particularly meaningful, but it is engaging in probably an unhealthy way at some point. And I would say that there are a number of things that make work engaging. People who study motivation, people who look at this in an empirical way, typically identify somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 or 4 characteristics that make work engaging. The first is having control, having autonomy, having the ability to make choices over your workplace. And we actually see it with very little kids. Kids who have an opportunity to make choices about the toys that they play with are much more engaged, much more interested than if they're told what they have to do, in which case, even though it might have been the thing they would have chosen, they end up backing off and they end up being less engaged. The second thing I would say about work that is engaging is that it is something that requires you to engage your own skill set and talents and may be difficult for you. So we're not particularly engaged by work that's very easy. Most people could sit in a toll booth all day and take money and make change, and it wouldn't be hard. Neither would it be engaging. It would be really boring. And so when we think about engaging work, we think about work that is pushing us, work that is developing our skills, developing our talents, allowing us to demonstrate what we call mastery over a situation. And then the third component is this notion of meaning. Engaging work, to be really engaging, is work that is doing something for someone else that we recognize as having an impact. So it's impacting other people in a positive way. And I said that there are 3 or 4 components to engaging work. And the reason I said that is because that notion of meaning is probably you can parse into a couple of pieces. So meaningful work is work that has an impact, but you can see that impact, and you typically see that impact on other people. So there's a relational component to meaningful work that makes it engaging. And so to the extent that we're engaging with other people, to the extent that we can see the impact of our work on other people in a positive way, that feels good to us. I think there's two issues at stake here. First, I don't think most employers really think about their employees as made in the image of God. And so that employee as an end in and of him or herself as opposed to a means to an end is part of the challenge here. But even if you take an instrumental approach to employees, I think there is a lack of understanding of when employees really do feel like they're engaged in meaningful work, they are more likely to work hard. They are more likely to go above and beyond. They are more likely to put themselves into that work in ways that they might not otherwise have. And I think we're a little bit short-sighted. I think we tend to look at A to B, and we don't look at A to B to C to Z. And we don't have that long-term perspective that really would take into account how meaningful work engages people. We're just looking at next week or next quarter and the outcomes associated with that short-term perspective, which tends to minimize the importance or value of having engaged employees. In fact, you can use people up in a really short amount of time and get something out of them that can make you financially successful, but in the long run, if you have used them up, you're not going to be long-term viable. And so I think having a long-term perspective, I think understanding the value of people as being made in God's image and ends in and of themselves, both would really contribute to having more organizations focus on and care about and think about how do we make sure that our employees are engaging in meaningful work? How do we ensure that they're doing what fits their own skill sets and interests? What kinds of stories are we telling about the purpose of our organization? How are we communicating the impact of what somebody is doing and how that influences other people, other organizations, the economy, the world? What is the impact of the work that we are doing in this organization? And are we telling that story? And I think that would be something that would also help to help people get more engaged.